Okay, let's see. Got it. Now oh no. All right, so we are live on YouTube. For some reason, it is not allowing me to go live on Facebook now, but we are live on YouTube. Um, so if you want to join us, definitely start sending in your questions and comments. But for today, I am joined again by Chris, and thank you for joining Chris and I as we delve into the background story of notable maybe mafia hitman Richard the Iceman Kuklinski. This episode contained, excuse me, sorry, I'm a little messed up on my notes here, but let's get back into it. This episode continues our series on the mafia and true crime as it is represented on the big screen and in real life. This episode will bring up topics that are not necessarily appropriate for all audiences. We're going to really try not to be graphic. I mean, in all honesty, we'll try to make it as less graphic as possible, but we will be talking about mafia and killing and contract killers. So just to let you know in advance. So what we're going to do today, Chris and I we're going to try to build some context on Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, and this will lead into the next few episodes where we'll talk about mobster Roy DeMeo and then the 2012 movie, The Iceman. We really think you'll enjoy these conversations and really this whole series and this series within a series. Uh, we're going to break down Richard Kuklinski's life into several sections because that's really how the books break up his life and how he broke up his life in his jailhouse series of 3 or 4 sets of jailhouse interviews, hours and hours of interviews, really his early childhood, his early life and life in crime, and then his later life in crime, and then the end where he's finally captured and prosecuted, and then his life in jail, which was a whole nother life after life. Just initially, Chris, what did you think overall of Richard Kuklinski?
I mean, when we were talking about this mob series and we mentioned like, oh, we got to do the movie Iceman, and then initially we were just going to just do the movie Iceman, but then I started reading more and more. Roy DeMeo has always kind of been a mob guy. I read a little bit about him, kind of found fascinating, but yeah, but then when we started looking into the Iceman, we were like really started looking into it like, yeah, we got to do, this guy deserves his own episode because it is really a crazy story about, like, is this guy telling the truth, is this guy not telling the truth, is how much is he lying, how much is he not lying, and there's opinions that vary where people say he's lying about everything, and there's people that just take him exactly at his word. And yeah, Richard Kuklinski, I mean, in terms of mafia guys, if you can really call him that. He's not really a mafia guy. He was kind of around them. I mean, his story is fascinating.
I remember when the Iceman tapes came out in the late 80s, maybe early 90s on HBO, and it was even too creepy for me to watch. I remember watching a little bit of it and turning it right off. And then a couple of years ago, I listened to some podcasts about him. I'm like, this is a strange guy. But then watching this movie and then diving into the deep dive of the research that we did, there's so much to him. And I think for me, he really dives into what history is. And I think that we're going to learn a lot more about him, hopefully, when historians start looking into a story as opposed to journalists who are looking at it in different ways. I think that we're going to learn a lot more about him because, like you said, there's so much obscured about his story. We're relying so much on what he said that I don't think, at least for a while, that we'll know the full story of Richard Kuklinski.
And it's also just the nature of the mafia in general, where a lot of this stuff is still obscure, like it's still covered up. And yeah, we know a fair amount, but there's a lot of I mean, if you listen to like Sammy the Bull, he puffs himself up, and I know a lot of people take his word on a lot of things that went down, but I mean, somehow he always makes himself look good, and he's one of the sources for a lot of these journalists. And just to like kind of use an example, like Richard Kuklinski he's not a household name, but he's a pretty famous serial killer. I mean, and the Five Families, which is by Celine Robb, I believe that's Rab, how you pronounce his name, is considered like the Bible of the mafia. In the initial prints, they weren't even they mentioned Richard Kuklinski, but they weren't even spelling his name properly. And another guy, Robert Pronge, which we'll get into the story too. They didn't spell his name properly either, and it just kind of shows you like the layers of onions you have to peel back to kind of
Yeah.
get at the core of this story.
Let's the I guess the logical place to start is in Richard's early childhood. That's another one that you see it develops along the way. And if you listen or read some of the early accounts, you get a slightly different version of Richard's early life. And then as you in the later accounts, you get a more fleshed out version of his life. What was the early childhood of Richard Kuklinski like in coming up in northern New Jersey in the 1930s, 1940s?
It it sounds like it was like but as rough as you could possibly imagine. Like the whole family grew up poor. I mean, he talks about having to steal food to just, feed himself and to feed the rest of his family. But his parents were something else. Like you would trigger, oh, maybe the mother was a little bit motherly. No, she was abusive, and his father, he well actually refers to his mother as just cancer. Like that's how he refers to his mother. He doesn't even call her by his name, and he doesn't even call his dad by his doesn't even call him dad or father or anything like that. He calls him by his first name, which drawing a
Stanley.
blank right now. Stanley. And Stanley was about as evil as a father could be to his own children. There's a story of him beating one of his younger brothers and just, punching him in the back of the head, and he killed him. And like Richard would get these types of beatings all the time, and his brother Joseph, and we're going to talk about his brother Joseph. The way that he was raised, it was like if you could set up a scenario to produce somebody like a Richard Kuklinski, like a hitman slash serial killer, you couldn't like pick a better factory to create it.
Yeah, it really does seem that with his family background that it's when you look at nature versus nurture, it really took both of them that he was born with the genes or the propensity to be evil, and then every single thing in his life just promoted that. It was like an incubator to be evil, like you said. His father killing his brother, and child abuse right in front of Richard, and then everybody in the family covering it up. And Richard, being so young, he sees his brother, he vividly describes that of seeing his brother laid out dead, and he just doesn't understand it. His brother was there one day after the beating that the father regularly gave all of them, he's not there anymore. And you could see how that somebody who is wired for that sort of to be a killer and to be, to break bad, you might say, everything lined up to just make this guy not right. And I would almost say when you listen to it, his early stories, I almost feel bad for the guy.
I'm not gonna lie, I do, because
He just didn't have a
I mean,
chance.
he didn't have a chance, and then like you pointed out, like there's not an exact science to it, but there's a theory that there is like a psychotic gene that certain people get, right? Like there's certain people that are born, they're not afraid of danger. And this is like
Hmm.
a lot of people, like they tend to go into activities like race car driving, skydiving, that type of stuff. And the theory goes is like it doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself are you're going to become psychotic, but you pushed in a certain direction, you're more likely to have that come out of you. And I mean, Richard, yeah, he didn't have a chance. Not to mention, he was like bullied too when he was a kid, and
Yeah.
so he's getting it from all angles.
Yeah, he was Polish, raised in a primarily Italian neighborhood in New Jersey, and so he was mercilessly bullied. His mom more or less hated him. And you can almost not even blame his mom because she was born in brutal circumstances, grew up in a terrible orphanage, where I think they said she might have even been abused in the orphanage. Like in a lot of ways, uh, it was like mass PTSD of generations of people, and it's not surprising that it was a more brutal world back then, not that long ago. Like in depending on how old people are out there, like your grandparents or great grandparents, they lived in that world that was just not as it didn't have as much of a margin as we have today, I think.
Yeah, and it's also like this particular family lived in this like alternate universe where like Richard talks about it in the Confessions of a Hitman, the Philip Carlo book, where like his father, he kills his brother, and then like he like slows down for like 2 months, and it's just like, okay, yeah, and then he just goes right back to it. Like he didn't like at no point did he just started doing the exact same stuff again. But in their mind, it's like, oh well, it's been 2 months, like
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
calmed
it's
down for a
2 months.
bit, like like it's just something that's very difficult for like a normal human being to really understand. But within that environment, I guess it would kind of make sense, where this is just how you were raised. You're just constant abuse around you all the time. And like you pointed out, the mother, and I think Stanley had a similar kind of upbringing. And then you just this is how like people talk about like generational poverty or generational violence. But I mean, this is kind of how it happens. It's like, well, this is how I was raised. Why is it any different
Yeah.
for them?
Then Richard does his very first murder when he's about 12 years old. He has enough of this bully, and he really just goes to beat him with I think it was a clothes, the pole you hang your clothes
Yeah.
on. He takes it and he beats this boy to death, and he doesn't get caught for it. And I think that's probably, I'm pretty sure that this is 100% true. And I think that that's what really set him, that, hey, I did this, I can get away with it. Nothing ever happened from it. That's probably the thing that really set him off for the rest of his life, really.
Yeah, and then like it also started early too with cats and dogs and like inventive ways of like getting rid of cats and dogs. I mean, play armchair psychologist or what have you, is he's having control over this bully and then those animals' lives, kind of in the sense the way his father has control over him. And he wants to have that type of power over other individuals that his father had over him.
Hmm.
And make sure like nobody else has that type of power over him like his father does or did. Um, yeah, I mean, and then those are like there's like a mutilation of like cats and dogs is usually a good sign of like this person has that type of gene. And
Yeah.
there's a good chance that it doesn't necessarily mean that like some kids are just weird and they do weird things, right? It doesn't necessarily mean, but it's a sign.
Yeah. I think
And
they say
even with
there's
the
three things that they look for, and you could even have all three of those things, like torturing animals. And it was, I can't remember what the two others. You could have one of them, two of them, three of them, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a serial killer. But if you start seeing those things, it's probably something you should really look out for.
yeah, and even with this bully, and according to Richard, from because he started reading a bunch of true crime stuff, he, like, so to make sure that he didn't get caught, he's like, oh, I got to remove the fingerprints and any dental records, which is, it just goes to show you that he's like, even at this young age, he's
Yeah.
thinking like he he's not, he's pretty smart actually, because most 12-year-olds probably wouldn't even think of that, but he's thinking about it.
Because Richard was not dumb. And we're going to see that in this next phase of his life where he's coming up. He's a small time hood in northern Jersey. He has a small gang that are doing small gang type stuff of stealing and stealing cars, roughing people up. But in the meanwhile, at least according to Richard, and this is something we can talk about, Richard's basically going into the predominantly the west side of Manhattan, and he admits to that it was almost one neighborhood. I think it was the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, which was right across the river from where he lived in New Jersey. He was going over there and killing vagrants, killing homeless people, killing people he would get into bar fights with. And he was killing them in all sorts of different manners, using guns, using knives, beating them. And he was using the knowledge that he had gained through these true crime novels to just kill people. And it's kind of amazing that it's amazing in one way, and you can kind of see how he did get away with it in the 1950s of killing a lot of people. Like, we don't know exactly, but he did certainly killed a lot of people.
Yeah, and it was like also the randomness of it, and I think he mentioned something about like the methods in which he did it too. He would always try to change it up so like the cops wouldn't be able to figure like, oh, this seems to be happening like a couple of times in a row now, where he, like you pointed out, he would just beat people. I think at one point he used a crossbow. He just happened
Yeah.
to get a crossbow and just wanted to see what it would do. And then like just random homeless people a lot of the times, which I mean, a lot of the times these people, they don't have, well, I mean, they have family, but their family is estranged from them and they don't know where they are. And it takes a while to identify exactly who these people are, because they're usually not carrying identification, and the cops don't really care all that much. And the rest of society, you can say whatever you want about that, but it's the reality.
Yeah, it makes
Yeah,
a
and I,
lot of
I tend to
sense.
believe, yeah, and I tend to believe this part of the story too, because it's hard for people to understand. Like, we're constantly under surveillance, and there's stuff like forensic evidence now, but in like the 50s, none of this stuff existed. There wasn't like cameras everywhere. You could easily just get away. You could easily just like kill somebody and like leave them on a park bench, and nobody would actually really know until probably maybe a day later, 2 days later, or even a couple hours later, and by that point, you're long gone.
Yeah, you think about it. And the neighborhood he was doing it in, Hell's Kitchen. If you go to Hell's Kitchen today, it's full of cute coffee shops. But that was back then, was ground zero. It was a tough neighborhood in a tough city, and people were dying all the time. And some beat cop's not going to take 2 seconds out of his time to really investigate murder of a homeless person. So it very likely that unless somebody actually saw Richard doing it, nobody would not even not be the wiser. Nobody cared.
Yeah, and the like Hell's Kitchen too. Like, we'll get into this with the Roy DeMille episode. I mean, this is where the Westies were from, which are like infamous, and I'm sure the cops didn't particularly like going into these neighborhoods in
Yeah.
general, because for the most part, you would go in there and try to find out what happened, and nobody would talk to you because everybody knew what would happen if you talked to the cops. And and probably in general, the people who lived in these neighborhoods didn't like talking to the cops in general, like even if nothing was going to happen to them.
Then it's interesting to bring up Richard's first family. For somebody who all he talked about in the interviews was that he would do anything for his family, and family. Yeah, he had a family when he was young. I think he was still in his teens even when he had started his first family. He had 3 kids with his first wife who cheated on him, and it was a whole thing. But then he just completely drops them, which is interesting to me. It really seemed to me like he hated them.
Yeah, it's weird in the Carlo book. Like they mentioned he had this family, and I mean they talk about it for a little bit, but they don't really get into a ton of details like exactly why Richard hated this family so much, and he didn't even really view the kids as his own. Maybe if she was sleeping around, maybe he did think, oh, there's a possibility that they're not even my kids, and he kind of got stuck in this situation, I guess, to a degree where uh, and maybe he felt like, oh, like this is my first, like, give me 1 second, where he's like you mentioned with his second family, it was like, oh, he was always talking about his family. Maybe he felt the same way with this, but he was really young and it just didn't work out. And
Yeah,
the relationship in general kind of reminded him of the relationships, his mother and his father probably had. And it's weird because in the book they talk about it and then it just kind of dropped. You just never hear about these people again. I mean, I guess they're lucky to a degree. They dodged a bullet.
for sure. Then Richard, then the next phase of his life really is that he tries to go straight. He's a he works as a trucker and an unloader, and it's interesting that he winds up working with and under Tony Provenzano, who was a major mafia figure and major player in the Teamsters Union, the Teamsters Union will come up in another uh, part of the conversation today. But he doesn't really handle that very well, that type of work. And he winds up getting a job in a movie production facility where they're making duplicates of masters of Disney movies, I believe. And he gets into some deals where he makes extra copies and then bootlegs them, which that sort of thing, like it sounds really scummy now, and it sounds like something that like you would get fired instantly. But I get the feeling like back in the 50s and the 60s, that's just stuff that happened.
Yeah, and they would sell the bootlegs till they're not really bootlegs. They're just copying the masters
Yeah,
and selling them to like local theaters at like half the price, right? And I mean, the local theaters are happy. They get to make a few bucks. It just seems like it's a win-win situation for everybody. And the studios are still making a lot of money, so they don't really care all that much.
yeah, it's not like today where they're so uh that copyright has become ironclad, and a lot of that started changing probably because they did over bootleg. But
Yeah.
as a part of that, where Richard had this production facility for making tapes, reel to reel tapes, he gets into pornography, and he really becomes a low end pornography peddler. And that's really the big thing that he's doing. But I get the read that it wasn't exactly illegal what he was doing. Some of it wasn't exactly illegal, but it was something that the mafia was heavily involved in. And that's really how he gets his first interactions with the mafia.
Yeah, yeah, it was something that the mob was heavily involved in, and I mean, it depends on the stories, I believe. Like he was just doing like he was just peddling like kind of normal, regular pornography, but then there's stories about some of the more extreme stuff that apparently Richard was peddling to, and we'll get into that with the Roy DeMeo. And but yeah, he was, from my understanding, he was really successful at it. That's where he made a big chunk of his coin, was distributing pornography and bootlegs.
He just seems like he was the type of person who he never, I mean, he freely admitted it. As soon as he got money, he just blew it instantly. And during certain parts of his life, he was a gambler and he would gamble away all his money, or he would drink all of his money, or he would use it to buy hot cars. Um, which will be interesting. It'll bring us to some other interesting avenues. But he was just a guy who, for a gazillion reasons, even in the mafia game and in the crime game, he never seemed to be able to get ahead of himself.
Yeah, the spending money as soon as you get it is, and there's been research about this. People that grow up in like kind of extreme poverty, the way Richard did, is they have this tendency to, as soon as they get it, they spend the money because they're worried that the next day it's not going to be there. And it's just kind of like something that goes down from generations to generations. And you'll notice it in real life too. Just if you're an observant person, if you notice certain people that are not the greatest with money, if you kind of get to know them a little bit, there's usually a whole backstory to it.
That's interesting you bring that up, because I think that with a lot of the things with Richard Kuklinski, they were multipliers. You look at
Yeah.
him and he is somebody who had zero impulse control. When somebody would flip him off on the highway, he would just go berserk. And he supposedly, or at least he claimed to have killed many people, where he just went nuts. Impulse
Yeah.
control. Or Barbara would talk about it, and his kids would talk about it, where when he would just completely trash the house in fits of rage. And people who have impulse control, a lot of times, if they have money, they're gonna spend it wantonly. And so I think that's another multiplier of that extreme poverty that he came out of, that you've got to spend money, you've got to look good, you've got to wear good clothes, you've got to have the car. And then the impulse control to thinking, well, if I save some of this money, maybe I can reinvest it into, even if you're a criminal, I can reinvest it into more crime stuff. He didn't do that either.
No, and it's funny you mentioned like it's one of the funnier things about his story is he used to buy like these really bright, like flashy suits with his money because he just enjoyed like having flashy suits. And I don't know, just I always found it kind of funny. Like you watch the Iceman interviews from the HBO documentaries, and then you read his story, and then this guy's rocking out like a baby blue, like, or yellow suit. It just
Yeah.
like it's funny, but it's like one of these things that's I mean, that makes him like a larger than life character. I mean, he really does kind of come across as like a comic book villain.
he the whole story of him meeting Barbara is really interesting, because everything to me screamed that Barbara should have stayed a million miles away from him. And it was really, this is my impression I got of it. She got caught up in his gravity. He was like a black hole. And once she got too close to him, there was no escaping him.
Yeah, there, like he was working at, I believe it was like a shipping and receiving thing, and at first he just kind of bumped into Barbara and they talked for a little bit, and the manager, the boss, told Richard, "You got to stay away from her. Don't you talk to her ever again." And Richard wasn't even thinking about her romantically in that sense, but as soon as the boss says like you can't have her, that was like, okay, Richard's like, I got to have her. And pretty much almost kind of starts like stalking her,
Mhm.
and they start dating a little bit. And then at one point, Barbara's family, because they're picking up kind of weird vibes from him, they hire a private investigator to kind of look into Richard, and they start, seeing things that, not the murder, but just a bunch of other like low end crimes and stuff that he'd been doing, and just words on the streets. And at one point, like Barbara steps back, but she says to herself, like, well, that's in the past. He's not doing that anymore. And then, this whole time he's still married to his first wife, which is another wild thing. And that's like a big thing in the Confessions of a Hitman book, where the people are really focused on, her family's really focused on, like, oh, you got to get a divorce, you got to get a divorce. And Richard kind of struggles, like, to get the money to get the divorce. But we talked about this earlier. He has like low impulse control with that. Eventually, he ends up getting her pregnant, and she starts seeing the real Richard, and she doesn't like what she sees, and she runs away, believed to live with her father in Florida.
Yeah.
And he goes and talks to her mother, and her mother's like, well, I'll tell you where she is, but you got to prove to me that you got the divorce. He ends up getting the divorce, and she shows him, tells him where Barbara is, and he finds her, and they end up getting married because I guess it's the right thing to do in that time. And
Mhm.
it's probably the worst, just, well, Barbara will tell you it was the worst decision she ever made in her life.
That and then the fact that once he was in, he there was just no leaving, and Barbara knew it, that there was no leaving him, that either he went to jail somehow or somebody was going to die, her mom, her dad, her. And how many times did he cause her to miscarry? I think it was 3 times through
Yeah,
beating
as the marriage
her
went on, it
or
was, yeah, it was like 3 times. And like even before they got married, he was like poking her with knives and like threatening to like murder her
yeah.
entire, but like I should laugh, but I mean it is like it's insane. Um and she told her mother this, and her mother's like, oh no, so this is where she is in Florida. And like and during their relationship, because like Richard refused to like do any contraceptive or what have you, she would get pregnant all the time. And like the first 3 times that she was pregnant, as you mentioned, she had miscarriages because of Richard's insane temper.
Yeah. That's I really tried to think of what could Barbara have done to get away from him. And in you think in so many cases with abused wives, and there's got to be something, but in a lot of cases, especially I think in this most extreme case, there was nothing she could do. Period.
No,
Nothing she could
it's,
do.
yeah, because I mean, you can get, in this particular case, he would have killed her entire family.
Yeah. She could have gone, say it was nowadays with, there's social services for abused women and all sorts of things. Even if that was available to her, he was going to kill her entire family and probably her.
Yeah,
And at that time she was young. She might have even still Barbara still might have been in her teens at that point, or early 20s. She had zero choices. I mean, you hate to say that, but she really did. There was zero she could do to stay away from Richard. Even her uncle, who was, I think, a police officer in
yeah.
somewhere in New Jersey, he went and talked with Richard, and Richard terrified him and made him
I
worried that he
know.
was going to kill him. And he was a
And
cop.
and this is the one that we haven't mentioned this yet, but like Richard Kuklinski was literally a monster, like in terms of like the stuff he did, but like he was a monster physically. He was like 6'5", 300 pounds, and
Yeah.
just built like strong as a strong man. And I mentioned this to you earlier, like I was at the gym earlier in the week, and I saw a guy, and I'm like, oh, he kind of reminded me of Richard just because we were talking about it. And I'm not a small guy at all. Like like I'm short, but I'm pretty thick, right? And well built. And I saw this guy, and he was like 6'5". He must have been like 330. And there's nothing I could have done if he really wanted to do something. He was just a freak of nature. And Yeah, that's just something like that we didn't really mention at the beginning of the show is like not only is he insane, but he's also like a monster physically. He's like the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah, I mean, they have stories where he literally ripped the door off of a car, ripped the door off of the hinges, and I believe it.
Oh yeah, because it is possible to do it, and he's picking up like I think it was like at one point it was like a marble table they just bought, and he throws it out the window, and Barbara mentions like it took like four guys to just get that up the stairs, and Richard just picked it up himself and just threw it out the window just because he was angry.
And you think about it, somebody who is that strong just naturally, and then when somebody's enraged and pumped full of adrenaline, and they're even, that magnifies their strength like that. He is as dangerous of a person with a absolute as short of a fused temper as you can possibly get, and they're physically a monster. Like, I mean, this guy he was a bad dude.
Oh yeah, and that was, and me and you were talking about it earlier. This is what kind of like separates Richard from some of these other type of serial killers, where like Richard was, we'll get into it, like his hitman like in career and shortly is like he was like, he was doing hits against, other tough guys, and Richard was like a legitimately like tough guy and physically strong, and where like a lot of these other guys, they're kind of, I don't know, they're kind of pathetic and they're weakly and they prey on, women and like the elderly, like in terms of like Richard Ramirez, and they weren't like really fighting and taking on guys that were maybe could have gave them a chance.
That leads us really into this mid part of his life where he's established. Eventually, Barbara and Richard have three children, two girls, Merrick, Chris, and then a boy, Duane. Richard's absolutely over the moon over his eldest daughter, Merrick, with his daughter, Chris, and he has a pretty cold relationship with his son. So that's his family life. They move into a nice suburb in New Jersey. But really, Richard's career this whole time, it's mostly just small time rackets that he's into. But what he claims is that he's making his money as a hitman and as an enforcer, uh, either killing people or collecting money for the mafia, people like Nino Gaggi, who's somebody who's as a name, keep that name in mind, because Nino Gaggi is a capo in the Gambino family, and his name will come up as we talk about Roy DeMeo and Richard. But I get the feeling that it's almost, you have to believe that Richard was probably just making his money through the pornography at this point, and maybe as an enforcer for the mafia. But it just seems to me like there's not a ton of independent evidence to support this being a hitman.
No, there's not. And I mean, he claims that he got into contact with, well, back it up a little bit. He claims that he was doing hits for the Devacanto. How do you pronounce it? The
Oh,
the
that
the New Jersey family.
it's the is it the Devacanti family? They were the ones who The Sopranos was based on, and they
Yeah.
were the big family of New Jersey. Oh,
Yeah, he claims that he was doing hits for that family, and I'm trying to remember. I can't remember for the life of me. I can't remember the guy's name that he was doing the hits with for, and he did that for a bit, and then he stopped doing that. And at the point that we're talking about right now, he's doing his pornography peddling stuff, and this is kind of where he claims he gets into contact with Roy DeMeo, because Roy DeMeo was basically the one funding all of this. And I know Roy takes a shine to him and kind of sees, this is what Richard claims, and kind of sees that Richard, they're like kindred spirits. And hires him for special jobs that he can't really get involved in, or people within his crew really can't get involved in. So I know people claim that this seems like this is a stretch that Roy DeMille would have a guy like this, because when we get into Roy DeMille, he didn't mind getting his hands dirty himself, hundreds of times. So I mean, but this is like a big part of Richard's story that he claims happened. It wasn't just like he was like a freelance guy too. So he was like doing work for all the different families, right? Because he was Polish, so he could never get made, and he was always kind of like kept on the outside. He was like a distant associate. I somewhat believe that this was the case. Just because if you look at something like, say, like Murder Inc., one of the reasons they hired a lot of Jewish and Irish guys, and there were Italians in it, but they hired a lot of Jewish and Irish guys, was because it gave them a little bit of distance from the inner Italian circle of the five families. And I mean, I don't find it's a stretch that they would pay them a fair amount of money to do some of the hits that they talk about in the book. A lot of these hits were like kind of personal jobs too. So and so broke my cousin's heart, and and I heard that this guy, did some things to his sister, and things of that nature. And then like collecting debt, it depends. Maybe you just don't have the time, and you hire it out to make sure that it gets done.
Yeah, it's the DeCavalcanti family of New Jersey. So we were pretty close with the name, and it doesn't really it's not super important, but I think the probably the most important fact is that if we believe Richard, that was his in to the mafia. The boss of the DeCavalcantis really liked him, and Richard says he did a lot of work for him, and that got Richard's name in with these other families in New York City proper. Some of the other things that I think in the Carlo book, and I think a lot of this is based on Richard's interviews, is that he makes himself out like he's an international hitman, like almost like the movie Assassins, or that video game. I can't think of the video game. Is it called a Hitman, where the guy's bald?
Yeah, I know who you're talking. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
It's kind of insane. Like there's one where he supposedly went to Rio de Janeiro to initially work out a drug deal with these Brazilian gang members who were in competition with the Colombian drug lords, but then eventually Richard kills them, and the story is so preposterous. It's either so preposterous it's true, or it's just total garbage. I don't think there's any gray in there.
I think in particular, like his international travels, like there's like a whole section in the Carlo book where I don't know, he's doing like the Nigerian money scheme, and he's going to like Zurich, and he's doing these like international like drug deals with the Colombians and Brazilians. Me personally, I think he's just kind of telling fibs about that. But I do believe that he did hits for the mob, and I do believe that he had more than just a kind of a passing relationship with Roy DeMille. Like I think Roy DeMille knew who he was, and either hired him to do work or told other people to hire this guy to get certain things done if you want it done correctly, and you would be able to keep a certain amount of distance between yourself and the crime being committed. I mean, and at the same time, he never would have been really part of the DeMeo crew anyways. I mean, him being Polish and various other reasons. I mean, that's not necessarily, I mean, Lansky was Jewish, and we'll get in when we get into Goodfellas. Robert De Niro's character was Irish. Um, but Polish seems, I don't know, like the Jews and Irish had always been doing work with the Italian mob anyways. The Polish thing was I don't know, like probably would. I don't think it's a stretch to think that was like something else entirely, and they really kept him to the outside and only used him for special hits. And I mean, and he also claims like he killed like Hoffa, and I don't know, I find that hard to believe. And he was like part of the Paul Castellano hit, but then he gets like certain details wrong about how that hit actually went down. I I mean, it's possible that he was part of those hits. But I don't think he had anything to do with that. I don't know. Maybe do you have a different opinion?
I think my strong sense is that he was always peripheral to the real mafia, that he was running his own scams and his own operation in New Jersey enough to make money, and he would supplement his income with things that were going on through New York City. And I think he probably did have some connection with Roy DeMeo's crew. What did they call them? The Gemini. We'll get into that at a different point. But that with Roy DeMeo, but I just don't think he was ever central to any of it. That he was always just a useful pair of hands that for certain jobs. As far as the Zurich thing, I think maybe he could have been involved in some small time early money wire fraud type deals, but I do not think that Richard was going to Zurich acting like he was some sort of international businessman. It's just could you picture somebody with, if you go and listen to the Iceman tapes, he has the thickest North Jersey working class accent. He's 6'5", 300 pounds. He's just not passing himself off as a high-end businessman in Zurich. I don't buy it. Maybe it's true, but I think that maybe he was involved in some sort of early 80s wire fraud type scam as just one of his many ways to earn.
Yeah, that's very possible. And like you pointed out, like he was always kind of on the periphery. Like during this whole time, he's doing like B&Es and other, like he's constantly doing like different scams. You know, and I'm sure for pornography distribution, he probably did travel around the United States. It would make sense. I mean, LA, like going to places like LA and like some
Yeah.
other bigger cities, but I mean, like, I don't know. It seems like going to. I like the image of him going to like being like this high like financial like scammer guy with that thick Jersey accent going to like Switzerland and like just talking to these people. It is a funny image.
Yeah, and then going over to Zurich, and I think he claims to have killed at least two people in Zurich, and like to see that and to think of that image, it's so crazy. It's like you said, like a Bond villain or
Yeah,
something. So
almost like a
that
comic book.
yeah, it's so crazy. So then that really leads us into his relationship with another person, this Robert Pronge, who was called Mr. Softy. He was the he's the one who supposedly taught Richard to freeze the bodies. And Robert Pronge, if I'm not mistaken, he was a something with the army. I heard a couple of different things. He had some sort of military service. He could have been as much as a Navy, not a Navy SEAL, a Green Beret or something, Special Forces. But then I thought I read somewhere else that he may have been in the Air Force, which is not known generally for its assassin style killing. But anyways, they really set Robert Pronge out as he's sort of a mentor assassin for Richard that brings him up to the next level.
Yeah, it's really, yeah. This to me is one of the more kind of thing. One of the one of the aspects of Richard's story that really hinges like is if Robert Pronge is real, then it lends a lot more credence to some of the other stuff that he says. And well, we know that Robert Pronge was. a real guy, and because there is a newspaper article about a guy that was, pretty much sounded like he was insane and
Mhm.
was shot and killed like at an ice cream truck. Um, yeah, so Richard bumps into Robert. I guess they were doing a job, um, two separate jobs at the same hotel or something like that, and they bump into each other at the bathroom. This is how Richard describes it, and they just kind of stare each other down because they both kind of realize that they're the same person, where they're doing the same thing, and they just kind of strike up a relationship, almost kind of like a friendship, where they're like showing each other just different ways of how they get their jobs done. And Richard had been fooling around with poison, like stuff like cyanide, just because it's really quick and it's efficient. Apparently, Robert Pronge had created this cyanide spray and various other ways of having to using it, and using like explosives. I guess that was from his military background. But the thing that makes Robert Pronge really stand out is he would drive around in an ice cream truck, and with the full like regalia and everything like that, and he would use this ice cream truck for surveillance. And I mean, it is kind of a brilliant idea because nobody would think that they're being surveilled by a good dude in an ice cream truck serving kids ice cream, because he would serve kids ice cream too. And they seem to strike up kind of a pretty good friendship. And it the way Richard describes it is, this kind of sounds like the only friend that he ever really kind of had. Somebody that they both really kind of understood each other because they were essentially the same person in a lot of ways.
And if you believe Richard's story, it's that Robert Pronge said he wanted to have Richard kill his own family for some reason. And I think it was kind of a convoluted reason of somebody who was pretty insane. And Robert Pronge claimed that he was going to poison a reservoir, that it would to kill one person, but an entire community fed off of this reservoir, that it would have killed an entire town or something, supposedly. I mean, I don't know. And then so I think that I don't know if Richard, I think he did wind up getting convicted for Robert Pronge's murder after he had been in jail. He copped to it for something else. I think he copped to it so that he wouldn't get the death penalty or something. And it was pretty, I mean, but I think that Richard probably killed him, but I don't think it was necessarily that important that he did kill him.
No, but the thing is, it's like we have that one newspaper article, and I mean, it checks, like apparently he was threatening to kill his family, and
Yeah.
he was like an arsonist, and like was a pretty insane person. And this kind of checks out with what Richard is saying. And I mean, it kind of lends a little bit of some of the other stuff he's saying, where like I do think that this Robert Pronge character did exist and was somebody like Richard that did, hits for the mob and did hits for various people, and used his military training background and to his advantage, and was, like a serial killer like Richard was. And the ricin thing is interesting. You mentioned that because his logic was like, well, if I just poison this whole reservoir, then they can't say like, oh, it was just directed at the two
It's
people that it was
crazy.
trying to kill, so
Yeah.
they would just have no idea. It's so smart. Like it's so stupid. It's so smart that it's stupid. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like I understand his logic behind it, but it's interesting that like even Richard was looking at Robert and going, "Yeah, this guy's insane." So how insane do you have to be for Richard to go, this is too much?
Before we go to the end of his career and how he's eventually caught, let's quickly talk about the Jimmy Hoffa murder, because that's a key one there that I think we need to talk about. nobody knows who killed Jimmy Hoffa, and a whole bunch of people have claimed to have done it. Uh, Most recently, probably the two that really the most famous one is that Frank Sheeran, who was the wrote, I think it was his biography was called, and we'll probably talk about this later, was called "So I Hear You Paint Houses," which was turned into the Irishman movie. He claims that he's the one who actually was the one who killed Hoffa, and then they had his body incinerated, and that was pretty much it. Richard Kuklinski says that he was a part of a hit team, and some of the details line up actually with what Sheeran says, that they lured him to this house, Hoffa to this house, but in Kuklinski's they rendering of the story, they load Jimmy Hoffa's body into a car, drive him back to Jersey, they bury him somewhere, and then they dig him up, and then they put him in the trunk of a car, which is compacted, and then it was sold off as scrap. So Hoffa was incinerated when they melted down the car, presumably.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like it's possible, but everything that I've read about people saying like it was, was Richard there when Hoffa was killed. I don't know. They seem to think it's ridiculous, but I mean, if he's telling the truth about Robert Pronge, maybe he knows a thing or two about this, right? Like that to me is what's so fascinating about the story is you're reading it and it's like, well, where does the truth start and where does the truth end? And like is he telling the truth here? Is he not telling the truth here? It's I don't know. What's your opinion on his connection with Hoffa? Because I think you had a slightly different take on it.
I think it's not entirely impossible. There were some things that seem believable on the story that maybe, as especially as opposed to Frank Sheeran, that Frank Sheeran was really good friends with Hoffa, and Frank Sheeran was also really good friends with Russell Bufalino, so maybe he would do the hit. But if we believe everything, that's what we have to do. Is if we believe everything that Richard said about him being a hitman, then he would be a really good person to do it. If he's full of it, then he's completely full of it. Um, and so I
Or
think
or maybe then maybe Frank and Richard kind of did it together and like not no like I assume they probably had no idea who they each other were, but you used Frank to, because Frank and Jimmy were best friends to get him in the house because Jimmy didn't think that Frank would, backstab him, and then the rest is history.
now eventually Richard is caught in the mid 80s by a task force of federal and New Jersey state law enforcement. And I kind of wonder, what were your thoughts about this? It's a pretty complicated story of a undercover officer who went by the name of Dominic Provenzano. He was an ATF agent who was in deep cover, and technically speaking, this had nothing to do with his job as an ATF. He was loaned out to New Jersey because he was such deep cover inside of the mafia. It's just so weird to me that the murders that Richard did, that he winds up eventually getting convicted of, they had very little evidence that he did it. I think for one, there was only a body of all the murders that he was eventually convicted of, the four or five of them. There was really only one that could definitively be attached to Richard.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Dominic Provenzano. I think it's so in the book, he talks about how he wears this wig and it just seems to really bother him. And he just keeps on talking about how this guy wearing this bad wig. Um, it is interesting that they only got him for, I mean, I think he was charged with the 5, but there was only the 100% for sure. But they do have him on tape talking about using poison. This is, I mean, I know there's different theories about why Richard was being so like kind of sloppy near the end, and it. I know I tend to think that maybe he was just getting tired of it, and he just kind of wanted to have it be over with. But there's also the theory that like he was just talking so openly because who cares? It didn't matter. He was going to kill Dominic anyways. That's what he was going to do. He was going to kill Dominic, and I believe he made up this Jewish kid that was ripping him off for a bunch of coke
Yeah.
money or something like that. And this is why he needed Richard to kill this Jewish kid, and he was going to get him the cyanide, and it is funny because like Dominic's like, oh, it's got to get done right now, and Richard's like, well, it takes a couple of days to make the spray, and he's like, no, we'll put it in egg salad sandwiches. And Dominic Provenzano comes up with this whole story about like how this Jewish kid like loves egg salad sandwiches. If you put an egg salad sandwich in front of him, he's gonna eat it, and like right. I just thought that was just something that he comes up with on the fly just to make sure he gets it. Yeah, it is interesting, and it is interesting how sloppy Richard kind of gets near the end, where he's just kind of openly talking about killing people and using different poisons.
I think that I never completely understood why they were so hot to get Richard. I don't understand where the pressure was coming from because he really, criminal wise, if Dominic Provenzano, I can't remember his real name, but that was his undercover name. If he was so deep into the mafia, it seems like there's a lot bigger fish to fry than Richard, because I think they must have honestly believed that he was the serial killer hitman that he was. I mean, that could be a piece of evidence to say that he really was the person that he claimed to be.
That's what I tend to think. Because it is kind of weird that they would be such this hoopla about, even at the time, like this was before Richard talked about anything. If you can go back and look at the news stories, it was like a big deal when they got Richard Kuklinski, um, this mafia hitman. So like that, the story about him being a mafia hitman goes way before he started doing the HBO, before he did the HBO documentaries. Which is why I find it hard to like, if people say like he's just like making it all up, like I find that, I don't know. I think that's not believable at all. I think he made up some stuff, yeah, but he was definitely, I think he was definitely a hitman for the mob, and he definitely killed a lot of people.
Actually, I think so we're going to stop for our recording of this episode for the podcast with that, but we have some comments from YouTube. So we have New Earth. He says Iceman wasn't doing hits for the mob or DeMeo specifically for that matter. He never knew DeMeo. Lies concocted in prison. He's a pathological liar. And I think that to have our after discussion here after the podcast, I think that's what New Earth brings up is really interesting, is that it's so bananas that that the things that his story through I think it was 4 interviews that he did for HBO, they continued to keep developing his story. You know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
when it initially came out, Richard didn't say very much. Then he said a little bit more, and then the 4th interview was one that he had with a psychologist who he liked, and he blabbed all this. So did he blab all this because he liked her and he felt comfortable with her? Or was it that this was his chance to just tell whatever the heck he wanted to?
I mean, it's possible, like the commenter was saying. I mean, if he's literally just making this all up, and me and you were discussing this, I go like, what a waste. He should have been making movies, because he like he really should have been, or writing novels or something, because it is an incredible story if this is all made up. Like Robert Pronge, like if he made that if he just made up like the ice cream man and the whole like the Mr. Frosty like hitman, um, I mean, it should have been like a comic book. It should have been a movie, and it reads like a movie.
And if you look at Barbara, I mean, so Barbara and the kids all admit that he was an extreme rageaholic. That's
Yeah.
absolutely the truth. And it makes sense that he could have done that serial killing in New York City. I think that the bridge too far for me is all of the hitman stuff, especially the international hitman stuff. Also, this one, it's good to talk about now, is that he had all this graphic footage that he recorded of him killing different people. And I would just think that
Oh yeah, using
somewhere,
rats.
yeah, that and other things that we won't mention on the live stream. But if there was some evidence of it somewhere, don't you think some of it would have surfaced? We were talking about this earlier, and you had some different ideas about it. I think that just there's something would surface on that, of physical hard evidence.
I mean, in terms of like I mean, it's called like snuff films or what have you. There's only ever been, I believe, like a couple that have actually been found. So I don't think it's unbelievable that like this footage is, I don't know, maybe it's locked in somebody's safe somewhere, but or it's just got destroyed or it's lost. I know maybe it is in someone's safe. I mean, it's very possible.
Yeah,
But
because
to me, it's not crazy. Like if nowadays it would be a little bit less believable, but back then, I mean, I don't think it's that crazy that I don't know, none of this footage exists.
yeah, I can see it that way too, that this is such, if it was true, that is such damning evidence to both, to Richard, to the mafia people who connected him to the people who wanted these things done, that they may have, like you said, locked it in a safe someplace, and it's been so long that they just, a family member said, oh, what's this, a reel to reel? Who's got reel to reels? Let's toss this out. Or that they destroyed it as soon
Yeah.
as they saw it. Like, who wants that hanging around?
Or as soon as Richard got snagged, it's like, okay, yeah, we got to get rid of this right now.
So that's not completely unbelievable to me. I think there's just so much to this story that is so fantastical, and it's so obscured. We're just never gonna know.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean to the degree is like what the fascinating part about his story is like where does the truth start and where does it end and eh, exactly who was Richard Kuklinski? I mean, and according to the commenters saying like he didn't know Roy DeMille, I'm like, well, he did know Roy DeMille, and Roy DeMille did know him. Like they knew each other. It's just a matter of how much did they know each other. Are they were they like close like they show in the movie Iceman? I don't know if that was really the case. It's possible, but I do, from what I've read, I do kind of think that Roy DeMille knew who Richard was, and maybe directed people to him that wanted certain things done that Roy didn't really want to do himself.
Well, I want to thank New Earth. Yeah, I think you're our very first commenter. We will be going live just about, normally they'll be Wednesday nights at around 8 to 9-ish p.m. Eastern time. So I hope, especially you, New Earth, you're our first person here. I hope you come and join us again. And it was great talking to you, Chris. And I hope everybody out there enjoyed this, and I hope you come and join us again.
Yep. Like, share, tell your friends. I'm having a blast doing these shows.
Yeah, we'll definitely see you Probably next week.